Welcome back to the Comfortably Hungry podcast for the first of my inter-season bonus episodes. I'm Sam Bilton, a food historian, author and award-winning podcaster who is perpetually hungry. Which is a good thing because today is National Macaroni and Cheese Day, which happens to be one of my favourite dishes. To mark the occasion, I thought it would be fun to delve into the history of mac and cheese with culinary historian Karima Moyer-Nocchi, author of The Epic History of Mac and Cheese. Now, I can't stress enough how fascinating I found Karima's book, so we had lots to talk about. But before we launch into today's episode, I just wanted to let you know that there will be another Serve It Forth Food History Festival online this autumn, which will feature yours truly. Early bird tickets are available until the 31st of July. I'll pop a link in the show notes so that you can get yours soon. It turns out that mac and cheese has a very long and auspicious history, so this episode is a two-parter. Today, Karima and I will explore the antecedents of this iconic pasta dish and how it found its way to England to develop into a recipe fit for medieval kings, complete with a liberal sprinkling of spices. Welcome to the podcast, Karima.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here.
And congratulations on the book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. I know that's a very geeky thing to say because I've also written my own books on single subjects. I think when people think mac and cheese, they think, oh, it's quite, mundane. But actually, it's a really fascinating history.
Thank you so much.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got into culinary history? And pasta in particular.
Yeah, I think, people in food, we have an affinity for food. And for me, that fascination began when I was in first grade and I got my first cookbook and it seemed so magical to me. And it wasn't just about the food that captivated me, but what food could do. I mean, I know it sounds so mature or something, but really it was about the love and expressing love. Through this creative act, making joy and making memories. So already at this early age, I had this. And then in my teens, I went through, that Julia Child phase and fascination kind of, it never left me. I love to cook. My real interest is less in the recipes themselves than in what food can reveal about societies and about us. And the people who create it and share it and exploit other people through food, all of the things that go on with food. Then, as for pasta history in particular, before I started in with the Epic History of Macaroni and Cheese, I had done a lot of work on a pasta history cookbook that combined recipes with the history of pasta behind them. And I didn't manage to get a publisher to latch on to this groundbreaking idea because while they're walking this fine line between wanting innovative ideas, which is what they say, and they're very wary of anything that hasn't been tried and true. So innovation and tried and true, it kind of, they've got to find that happy medium. And one publisher who rejected me even told me that they wanted cookbooks to help people get dinner on the table. And I'm thinking, well, when is it that people buy cookbooks to get dinner on the table? They serve so many other purposes. Bringing together, connecting us through places and people and traditions and all of that. But the whole time that I had been working on this a pasta history cookbook, I was carrying on a fling on the side with macaroni and cheese. And it was just a dalliance at first with during the COVID distraction kind of time when you're looking for a project. But the more time that I spent in that space, it kind of cauliflowered out into this atomic explosion. And I then spent 5 years researching the epic history of macaroni and cheese and was just endlessly fascinated by the way that the dish adapted and changed meaning over the course of time.
It's a fascinating history, an absolutely fascinating history. and a very long one as well. So we can't cover the whole book, unfortunately. I wish we could, but that would probably be about 3 or 4 episodes worth. Can you give us a little synopsis of its origins in the ancient world?
Yeah. So as a historian, I'm cautious about the word origins and origin story, which there's so many of those in culinary history. It suggests that there's this single moment when something suddenly begins. And history is rarely that tidy. So what we can talk about is antecedents. And in this case of macaroni and cheese, I take those antecedents back to ancient Rome. Now, the earliest documentation that we have of a shaped dough, which is layered with cheese, comes in 160 BCE with Cato the Elder in his book De Agricultura. And this wasn't just a cookbook, and indeed it wasn't a cookbook, but a manual on managing the aristocratic estate, so the senatorial estate, the latifondi, as they were called. And Cato was a conservative senator, very worried about the fraying of Roman traditions. And among those traditions is a dish that is called placenta. That's why I don't call this an origin story, but an antecedent, because he wasn't making up dishes, but underscoring the edifying traditions that had existed for some time. So by the time it gets into this cookbook, it's already a tradition, which is why it's even there. And that brings us back to what I was saying about meaning. Placenta is a ritual dish. It's associated with a special occasion. Now, if you just think about any important holiday dish, things that are really important to us, that they get done correctly and that the proper person actually execute the dish. And so what we have then in these situations is taste, aroma, anticipation, mouthfeel, that whole kind of panorama of what happens with food put together with the shared experience of eating. And all of that gets bound up with memory that gets carried out year after year. In addition, that already carried a social and symbolic significance. So that's why I trace it back over time. That's the thing that interests me a lot about this dish, not pasta and cheese necessarily, but the way that combination changed through time, and I do then begin in ancient Rome.
So let's skip forward. So quite a few years, or quite a few centuries. What was macaroni and cheese like in the Middle Ages?
Okay, so in Rome, what we've got Cato, and then we've got the Apicius, the surviving recipe compilation from Rome, which also has an antecedent to this dish. Then we have a gap of 800 years in which there isn't another surviving compilation. And what's remarkable, though, is that when it reappears, we can see a certain continuity between ancient Rome and the Roman dish and what happens then in the Middle Ages. I think the first thing that we should clear up here about the Middle Ages is what macaroni means. Macaroni as the pasta foodstuff is the existing shapes, of which there weren't many at the time, were all macaroni. So except for vermicelli, which gets set aside, and ravioli, which gets set aside to that. So we're talking about the squares and the little rolled up shapes, and gnocchi even were all considered macaroni. It's hard to get your head around this other idea, is that until through the end of the 18th century, pasta was almost always dressed with cheese. And by cheese, I mean no sauces. That's, of course, the exception to that is religious situations where the dietary strictures didn't allow dairy and come up with other things. Other than that, cheese was the only game in town, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't variety. So pasta could be cooked at this time in particular in a rich, fatty meat broth. Now, the fat is then going to, both the broth and the fat is going to give it a wonderful umami depth, and that extra fat. So you also have the association of fat and pasta and a macaroni. Later, as a kind of cross contamination, there was also butter. So, and the butter is going to come from other exchanges with Northern Europe. So you've got grated cheeses, a spice mix, and often sugar. Now, sugar didn't make it into a dessert. It was an expression of wealth. It also gets carried on from Queiroz placenta. Okay. So because Queiroz placenta was also laced with honey, and that indicated it was something special. It was not a dessert. In ancient Rome, they didn't have that concept of dessert, and it certainly wasn't a sugary dessert. But sugar then carried on the meaning that honey had. So it was something that was health giving. It was an expression of generosity. So the medieval spice mixtures would contain cinnamon, ginger, cloves, pepper, and these all reflected cosmopolitan tastes of the medieval elite and the high clergy. And this reminds us that macaroni and cheese was kind of anything but a rustic. We have this association with it being Italian food, and we love the rustic thing and the tradition, all of that. So then in the early modern period, what changes is you pull back from that heavy spice mix, and it just becomes cinnamon and sugar. And with cinnamon and sugar, we need to think, why do we salt and pepper everything? Just as they cinnamon and sugared everything. So, and particularly macaroni and cheese. That was the way to prepare macaroni. And again, it didn't mean that it was a dessert, because it was still being cooked in broth. On meatless days, then it could be cooked in milk, which of course would carry through to the macaroni and cheese that we think of today.
I think that was, for me, the surprising thing, because I've grown up with this dish, and we in the UK, we always make it with a roux-based cheese sauce, milky sauce. And I'd seen recipes where it's been cooked in stock. I suppose I'm so used to looking at medieval recipes, and a lot of medieval recipes contain spices. So I don't think most people would expect to find that level of spicing in this particular dish. I know it's very, for the time we're talking about, it's absolutely normal.
And it is really delicious. And I always enjoy when I do historical demos, I enjoy watching them get kind of creeped out while I'm, got the sugar and the meat broth and everything's going on, and maybe some goat's milk with bread in the dough and everything.
So how does macaroni and cheese then, how does this recipe spread beyond Italy and eventually get to Britain, where I'm based?
The Middle Ages. It sounds like this dreary interval when nothing really happened, this dank corridor between the Roman Empire and the Renaissance, so these beautiful periods. But in reality, it was an extraordinarily vibrant, mobile period. And it's really the key to understanding how macaroni then did move out of Italy. So let's consider the 14th century. Again, we went all through all that time with no cookbooks. And this was marked by 3 Jubilee years. I've found that maybe because I live in Italy, I know what a Jubilee year is. Jubilee years are the years in which you're going to get indulgences. And so if you do that pilgrimage, and so it had a lot of people coming through across Europe, particularly England, the Via Francigena.
But yes, they were coming down from basically Canterbury through France, Switzerland, down to Rome. Is that correct?
Right. And so those famous pilgrimages, right? So preserved in the Canterbury Tales, etc. So those journeys brought thousands of people traipsing in and out of Rome and carrying with them their taste ideas and then taking those experiences back. So it was a really important time when you really have a concentrated amount of people. And one of the things, so putting global disasters in with that, one of the reasons why people were so interested in moving, you've got the 100 Years' War and the plague and the little ice age. And these are displacing households, but also people wondering what is it that's plaguing humanity to the point that, we've sinned somehow and we need to get to Rome. So that had a lot of people getting into Rome. Wars are another, I'm going to use the word great, but powerful engine for culinary exchange with armies that don't travel alone. You've got kings and nobles and military leaders all moving with these large households that included, of course, cooks. I mean, people needed to eat. And they're encountering new ingredients and exchanging ideas and techniques and dishes and etc. Also, in this period, you've got aristocratic marriages, and this is similar effect. Europe's ruling families were constantly intermarrying, relocating, castle hopping, and bringing with them in their retinues their cooks and their servants and their traditions. So this was also the time of the International Gothic. And that was an artistic kind of competition, cosmopolitan courtly culture that transcended boundaries. It was an important time for mercantile networks. There was a very intricate mercantile systems that were going on. And I always like to argue that food corridors are much more impactful in the evolution of human history than for political borders, but then I'm a culinary historian. So, and England, of course, was very much part of those networks. Now, consider that you have Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, who himself was deeply interwoven with this early history of macaroni and cheese. He marries Isabel of England, who is a Plantagenet princess, and their marriage is just one example of how closely connected the European families are and about those systems of distribution, and how they're going to cross more than political boundaries. So against this backdrop, this whole thing going on with all of this movement, I hope that I've illustrated, the Middle Ages was really a vibrant time. It's actually more delightful than surprising to find the first recipe that is explicitly called macaroni in the title, not in Italy, but in England. And that certainly gets the Italian gander up. And I like to emphasize that there were macaroni, not called macaroni, but pasta and cheese recipes. There were a whole slew of them before this recipe that is explicitly titled macaroni in 1390 in the form of curry. But even there, also interesting, you can still see that tie back to placenta, because this is a layered dough, sheets of dough layered with cheese in the same tradition that we had in ancient Rome.
And spices as well?
Not in that particular one. There are spices in some of the other English pasta dishes that are also sheets, or again ravioli filled with cheese, and spices are employed in that, but not in this particular one that's just called macaroni. But importantly, it has butter. And butter then is going to, with all of that movement going out, the butter aspect is going to come into Italy as well and become a fixed part of what defines macaroni and cheese.
We can perhaps claim to the first written, that's been discovered, I'm going to say, the first written recipe to be discovered to date of the term macaroni with cheese. But, anyone who knows anything about English food history knows that we doff our cap to the France. Kind of ironic given the fractious relationship we've had with that nation over the centuries. So, what influence does French cuisine have on the evolution of macaroni cheese? Because I'm guessing if it got here, it must have got there as well.
Oh, absolutely, because we're not flying to England.
No.
So you've got that movement in and out. It's got to go through France. France will then assume the lead on the gastronomic stage. In the mid-17th century, particularly with the publication of La Varenne, the cookbook, it was 1651. Now, there are only hints of pasta and cheese in the French cookbooks at this point. But when macaroni and cheese does appear in a very clear sort of way, it's clear that a great deal has been going on in the development behind the scenes. So England, meanwhile, although politically at odds with France, as you said, was intensely curious about French cuisine, interpreting it through their own temperament at the table. So one of the people who bridged that curiosity was Vincent Lachapelle. Now, Vincent Lachapelle was the chef to the Earl of Chesterfield and one of the greatest cooks of his age. But he was operating, throughout Europe, but in an English kind of context. He publishes his cookbook, The Modern Cook, in English first. So it's at 1733. And then later he publishes it in French in a multi-volume, and it gets more expanded in French. But what do we see here? We see through his recipe that the French have appropriated macaroni and cheese because the macaroni and cheese dish is just called a macaroni pie. Meanwhile, he's got this other really bizarre thing called macaroni the Italian way, which I don't know what kind of Italian way that was, because it was just a description that will take us out of the scope of our discussion. But we see is that the French are pulling this dish into their inner sanctum, where it becomes richer and creamier and Frenchier, and it's presenting. Now, if we consider what time period this is, we're moving away from the grotesque kind of luxury, the piling it on luxury, to elite refinement. So we find our macaroni now in a raised pie, and it's a spectacular kind of way to showcase dishes. So it's designed to demonstrate a cook's virtuosity, which is very much of what La Chapelle was about. And of course, the French get rid of all of that sugar and cinnamon confusion, which is associated with Italy. And they want to make a distinction between that broadcasting of spices and discernment. That's very much of what the 18th century is about. So the appropriation then went beyond the recipe itself. In the 1760s, we know that France is already manufacturing commercial macaroni, and probably was before that, but I like to say that the documentation supports that clearly in the 1760s.
So when you say commercial macaroni, you're talking about sort of dried macaroni that you could go to a grocery store and buy at this point?
They are extruding macaroni and setting up their own macaroni manufacturing, which is very much the way of saying this is now ours, because it's so important and commercially viable that there is a market for it. It's not just a tasty dish. So the French are also transforming the cheese profile. Parmesan and the Italian provola and other things were not melty cheeses. The Parmesan, when it's mixed in a certain way, is going to create a creamy cheese, but it's not the mellow preference that the French have using their Gruyere, which they had appropriated several hundred years previously from the Swiss. But let's not talk about that. So we've got the Gruyere, and it's creamier and more mellow than the distinctly sharper Italian versions. So we have William Verrill, who, while you've got Hannah Glass, who in her vitriol against the French, who regardless has so many French recipes in her cookbook.
Yes.
You've got William Verrill, who was a publican
He was indeed. I live near, in fact, I had dinner at his pub not so long ago, a few weeks ago. I live, it's a few miles from where I live, the White Hart in Lewes.
Oh, okay, great.
So it's still there. I can't say that they have any of his recipes on the menu anymore,
okay.
but it's still, the White Hart still stands in Lewes, a very historic town in Sussex. So yeah, it's if anyone's in that neck of the woods.
So he tries to, bring together the marriage of French and English cookery.
Yes.
Trying to say, oh no, it's really okay if we do. And his father had made sure that he had a background in French cookery. One wonders quite how much he would have understood from the man who was teaching him, because of some of the just bizarre titles that he has in his book. But he really did try.
So we should talk about this, because I think this is one of the, as both of us being culinary historians, something we come across a lot, where a word is used and it's, to most people reading these texts, would be completely out of context, because I believe his recipe is for macaroons and cheese. And when I first read it, I was like, crikey, that's a combination and a half. I'm used to seeing sugar in savoury recipes for macaroons. Right. To me, a macaroon is a little almond biscuit. That's right. And then when you actually read the recipe, you're like, okay, he must be macaroni. But he calls it macaroons, doesn't he? Macaroons and cheese. But it is mac and cheese at the end of the day. It is
mac and cheese, even though
not
biscuits. Macaroons are something, yeah. And he does at this point, there's a separation between the sweet and the savory. And he's got his sweet version of macaroni. So macaroni's maintaining that combination with sugar, but as a pudding. And then veering off into a very separate kind of savory dish. But I talk about the situation of how long it took, and I use a lot of different dictionary definitions of just watching the word macaroni kind of settle into the vernacular and how that happened. But yeah. And it did get confused with macaroons. Yeah.
Yes. So we have these two dishes now, as you've said. We've got a savoury version, and because again, I don't think not in this country anyway, many people would think of pasta being in a sweet dish, but we do see macaroni puddings as in something sweet. In the second part of this episode, Karima and I chat about colonial FOMO, the macaroni fashion craze, and debunk a stubborn gastro myth concerning mac and cheese's popularity in the US. We'll also find out what dish Karima is bringing to their inter-season potluck supper. Don't forget that you can find links to Karima's website, social media and books, including The Epic History of Mac and Cheese, in the show notes. In the meantime, do check out my other podcast, A's for Apple, the culinary encyclopedia that explores food history and culture a letter at a time, which I host with fellow food historians Dr. Neil Buttery and Dr. Alessandra Pino. I'll be back soon with part 2 of this episode. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you really loved it, please rate and review it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, as it really will help other listeners discover Comfortably Hungry. Don't forget to pop along to sambilton.com, where you'll find details on my books, which include my latest publication, Much Ado About Cooking, written in collaboration with Shakespeare's Globe. This new cookbook features recipes inspired by the food in the Bard plays and was huge fun to write, so I think it will be right up your street. You may also want to subscribe to the Comfortably Hungry Substack, which includes more detailed notes from the show. You can subscribe for free, but if you become a paid subscriber for £3.50 a month, you'll also get recipes inspired by the topics covered in the show and access to extra content. Alternatively, you can leave me a one-off tip via Ko-fi to show your appreciation. Just click on the relevant link in the show notes. Your support will help fund the research required to produce Comfortably Hungry. It also means that I can avoid including those pesky ads that may interfere with your enjoyment of the podcast. If you have any questions relating to this season's theme, you can leave a comment in the chat section of the Comfortably Hungry Substack page or tag me on social media. Remember, you can find me on Instagram, Threads and Blue Sky at Mrs. Bilton, that's with 2 S's. I'll be plunging back into the liquid world of food and drink history soon, but until then, take care. Comfortably Hungry is research produced and presented by food historian Sam Bilton, with sound mixing and production by Thomas Dinas of the Delicious Legacy podcast. Additional sound effects and music are provided by Zapsplat and Pom5.